Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Welcome to the best 1 o'clock show in town. We're pleased to have you here today. Presentation on investment in natural hazards mitigation. We're going to hear firstly from Paul Barker, who's the director that sponsored this work at DIA, and then we're going to have about 30 minutes from Peter Clough, who's led this work. Then we've got an illustrious panel of Ken Warren, Graham Campbell, and Wendy Saunders as well. So they're going to finish things off. We're going to do our best to stick to the hour. Just on Zoom protocol, then we'd like to make sure everyone, please, if you could stay on mute. It is pretty much one-way traffic today, so it's a presentation, but there will be questions out of this, and we really do want to make sure you're engaging back with the team here at DIA on those as things come to mind. Write them down, and we're encouraging you not to use the chat button at this point as well, but we do want to absolutely hear from everybody as we go. So, Paul, over to you.
Kia ora koutou. A big welcome to everyone this afternoon. There's been a high degree of interest, and we're very pleased to see sort of people from so many different agencies, some very familiar faces, but for those of you who I don't know, I'm Paul Barker. I'm the director leading the community resilience work here at DIA. Just by way of just a couple of quick sort of sponsors comments. I mean, the context for this report is a community resilience work program which has been sort of underway for about 2 years now, and I stress it's an all of government initiative which includes working in partnership with local government. And a big focus of this work is the need to shift the natural hazard risk management system to more of a focus on risk reduction. So this topic for many of you is obviously not at all new, and it's very explicitly recognised in the National Disaster Resilience Strategy as one of the 4 Rs. Last year, a colleague, Michael Lovett, and myself were fortunate enough to do an international fact-finding tour overseas, and we were really struck by the number of experts who referred to very positive cost-benefit ratios from hazard mitigation. And particularly in the United States, there's a lot of quite strong evidence, meta-analysis that's been built up over a decade or more by the National Institute of Building Sciences. And we thought, look, this sounds really promising. How does that sort of fit in New Zealand? And it's really these insights that prompted us to commission NZIR to take a look at this area. And we asked them to do 3 things. One was to look back in the rear view mirror and to examine what natural hazards had cost central government over the last 10 years. And then we asked them to forecast what this might look like going forward, and including the trajectory if we take in climate change effects. And then the third part of the study was to really try and sort of shed light on areas where there was good, robust evidence for where investment in hazard mitigation could best take place. As this work was commissioned, we were really quite fortunate in drawing on some work that OAG, the Office of the Auditor General, had also begun, and that was to take better account of what these costs were within government. Now, they're the first to stress that there are some really significant limitations on the data that's been reported within government, but it does provide an up-to-date baseline and certainly a focus for further work. So today's presentation, we've asked NZIR to present these findings to a wider audience. So we know that there's going to be a lot of interest to other agencies, and as Todd's indicated, we've got 3 commentators who are going to just give very kind of short summary reactions from central government, science and local government perspectives. As Todd's mentioned, while we haven't built in time in the session to take questions, we'd be really pleased to follow up anything with you. The email address to send any queries to is prema.waghorn@dia.govt.nz, or myself, paul.barker@dia.govt. And we'd be really pleased to contact you and keep in touch. But I'll now ask Todd to introduce Peter Clough, who will be giving the main presentation.
Yes, kia ora koutou. We still have quite a few people joining, so just a reminder, if you could please keep your microphones on mute. And the run sheet then will be that Peter's going to speak to us for about 30 minutes, and we've got this illustrious panel that Paul just mentioned as well. So just now I'm handing over to Peter, who's going to present for the next 30 minutes or so. Peter's a senior economist at the Institute and has got a long-standing expertise in environmental domain, and has also been a strong lead in some of the cost-benefit work that we've done in the Institute over the years. So he's been our primary point person on this project. And just to add that I think it's been an exciting project from the point of view that we actually feel we really have been able to uncover some things that haven't been fully looked at before, and really I think some useful pointers for both central and local government in terms of aiding some of the important and difficult decisions that lie ahead of us. So Peter, over to you.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, we're just going to see if we can get the slides up now.
Yep. Right, good afternoon. Next slide, please. Yes. We'll just start by recapping what we've been asked to do, which is basically look at what central government has spent on natural disaster recovery over the last decade by hazard type. Now we've got a selection of pictures here which don't quite cover them all, but the hazards were basically two geophysical hazards, earthquakes and landslides, two climatological hazards, the drought and wildfire, two meteorological hazards, which are basically storm events plus pluvial or fluvial flooding, and two what would be called hydrological hazards, three hydrological hazards, coastal flooding, coastal inundation, which is more longer term, and then the coastal erosion caused by wave action. Next slide, please. So we'll just recap what we're asked to do and also what we weren't asked to do. We're basically looking at central government agencies and their spending. So it's departments, Crown entities and any other agency basically that depends on vote appropriations from central government. We've also been asked to look at the contributions they make to both both recovery but also reduction efforts, and to think about the insurance implications of looking into the future, and also to think about the different requirements between communities. So there's a question about is the hazard risk evenly sort of spread across the country? Now what's out of scope is basically non-financial impacts, and also the liabilities for local government, insurance industry and private parties. Now a little slight proviso on that, we do spend quite a bit of time going through the insurance data, looking at the number of events that have taken place by different hazard type. And we're doing that to try and establish, if you like, what is the cost that's been incurred by different hazards or caused by different hazards. And we do that to try and then link that to the level of government spending or, associated with different types of hazard over time, and also by the scale of the hazard event. What's also out of scope are volcanoes and tsunami risks, and clearly these are major natural hazards, but they also are quite infrequent, and the choice of mitigation is somewhat limited there, other than having an alert system and having an evacuation plan. So we've decided not to look at those, or been asked not to look at those, and rather look at the 11 hazards we've identified earlier. Slide, please. Maybe we should also get out of the way at the start some limitations around the study. Many of those are around the fact that it's difficult to actually access data to match the ambition of the project. Both within New Zealand and also internationally, it's fairly unusual to find a broad overview of all of the hazard types and all of the impacts that they have on communities, and how that then feeds through to impacts and liabilities for government. So in some senses, we're also breaking slightly sort of new ground here. The other thing is that much of the spending is actually hidden in departmental baselines. It's already accounted for, but it's very hard to actually ascertain how much it is. Just as an example, for the New Zealand Transport Agency, for example, spends about $80 million per year on emergency works. Now, these are largely due to natural hazards. Think of slips, washouts, and so on. But it also includes responses to some human-created accidents and getting their networks back running again. And also may actually cover some wear and tear just caused by heavy traffic and potholing and all the rest of it. The same applies to other departments. It's very difficult to determine what's caused by natural hazards and what might be coming under other types of expenditure. Now, specific appropriations and supplementary appropriations tend to be more visible than the baseline, and so that's been a focus of one of the focuses of our inquiry. We've also been thinking about the future and how recovery costs are likely to change in future, not just because of climate change, but also because of the way that demographics are changing. Population gets larger, economic activity gets larger, the value of the assets supporting economic activity also rises, and therefore the value at risk goes up over time as well. Now, we don't forecast in detail in the sense of creating scenarios with lots of variables to change, because that simply increases the number of assumptions to be made about things that happen in the future. But we do make some projections based on the Ministry for Environment forecasts of climate change impacts up to 2050, and hope that that provides some indication of the direction, if you like, of the way that things are likely to move in future. Thirdly, there are some issues around, or limitations around, the coverage of hazard type by the data. We use insurance data to a large extent, but that only really covers earthquakes, weather, and wildfire and floods. It doesn't distinguish other hazards as separate items. Similarly, droughts cause loss of production rather than asset damage, so there's not really any insurance liability there, but there is still a economic loss, and that doesn't actually appear in the insurance data, so we have to deal with droughts slightly to one side compared to the other types of hazard. Finally, of course, there's a 10-year sort of time frame which rather limits the expected time trend analysis, and so we've got a really sort of narrow base, if you like, on which to base our projections. This is basically an exploratory study. By no means the last word on government liabilities for natural hazards in New Zealand, but we hope it, or we think it actually provides a stepping stone for something greater into the future. Next slide, please. Well, if we look at the historical record over the last 10 years, we see that basically earthquakes dominate the recent losses. Not really surprising, perhaps. These figures basically combine the claims data in private insurance and the EQC. These represent losses, which are a large part of the direct impact of the hazards. We're basically running the standard approach to thinking about disaster costs in terms of their direct impacts. That's the damage to infrastructure, property, casualties caused by the hazard event. The indirect impacts, so these are the consequential disruption, the call out of emergency services, and of course the cost of recovery. And thirdly, there are the intangible impacts, loss of life, incapacity, and also loss of heritage. Now, in common with a lot of international studies, we tend to focus on the insurance, which is only really a small part of that. It's part of the direct impact, because it is the most quantifiable one. And we're using it, as I do other studies, as if you like an indicator of the level of damage that we've experienced over the last 10 years. So between 2009 and 2018, natural hazards caused a set of claims of $37.5 billion. Now, earthquakes accounted for 96% of that. The weather events are about 3%, floods about 0.8%, and wildfires for the rest. Now, the earthquakes are clearly primarily attributable to the Christchurch sequence, impacting on an urban area. The Kaikoura earthquake in 2016 was more powerful in magnitude terms, but only had 1/10 of the economic impact because it fell in a rural area. The combined losses for the other hazards, apart from earthquakes, obviously vary quite a bit over time. They go up and down quite a bit. Now, what the literature tells us is that the potential harm of a hazard is actually a function of its characteristics, how big it is, the exposure of people and buildings to that hazard, and the vulnerability of people and buildings to suffering under its impacts. And as hazards are driven by natural forces beyond human control, most of the mitigation we're talking about really focuses on reducing either the exposure and or the vulnerability of people and buildings to those risks. Next one, please. Now, again, looking at the insurance data, this time excluding the EQC claims data, and the reason for that is because they have a different way of categorising claims, and we cannot match precisely the EQC data with the insurance data from the data sets we have. So looking purely at the insurance data as a reduced set, if you like, of the direct losses, we find that there are 35 weather events which caused cumulative claims of $890 million over the 10-year period. One event alone triggered losses of $130 million. Now, weather events and insurance records also include secondary impacts like landslides and some floods, fluvial and storm surge, etc., may actually be covered under weather, the way that the data is recorded. Now, there are 28 mainly fluvial flood events. By fluvial, I mean the case of rivers rising and overtopping their banks. And these also exhibit a fairly variable patterns from year on to year. So some years are quite large and some years very little at all. Now, we shouldn't forget droughts, because though they are slow onset events and they do not show up in the insurance record, they are probably the second most costly natural hazard event after earthquakes. There's been a drought declared in at least one region for most years in the 10-year period we looked at. Now, there were two economic impact studies of droughts, one in 2008, just before our inquiry period, and one in 2012 to 13. And both of these suggest that each drought had a direct and indirect impact of over $1 billion per year. So droughts can be quite big, but they sort of creep up unawares. Next slide, please. Now, if you think at the distribution of these events over time, again, we're looking at insurance payouts and again, trying to exclude earthquakes, because if we put earthquakes in this graph, then Canterbury would be the only thing you could see. Everything else would pale by comparison. So the biggest losses were suffered by Canterbury due to earthquakes, but also even after excluding earthquakes, Canterbury is still the region that has most of the losses attributed to it. But it's sort of followed by the Bay of Plenty, Southland, Otago, and then Manawatu, Wanganui. Marlborough suffered no losses at all. Wellington, Gisborne, and Waikato have very low losses. Now, part of the reason why this is a reduced set of insurance figures is that some of the events in the insurance industry record are just described as North Island storms. And they may have another generic term. And where that has been the case, we haven't tried to attribute that or distribute that across the different regions. So we're only seeing here the impact of events which have been clearly identified as falling in a particular region. If we could distribute those other event costs accurately, then obviously the pattern would change a little bit, but probably wouldn't change the fundamentals. We'll probably see broadly the same general pattern. It's just that it's slightly bigger. Next one, please. Now, turning to what the government actually spent in relation to these events, this graph shows the results taken out of the Office of Auditor General's review of 10-year spending. Basically, it found that central government spending was about $11.3 billion, or over that, in the 10-year period of 2009 to 2018. The OAG divided its spending into three categories: risk reduction, response and recovery, and then other civil defence. Now, response and recovery is the largest category of government spending identified. This will cover both the short-term emergency services response, but also the longer-term recovery works and getting the communities back in action again after a major event. It accounted for 48% of the central government spend, or 11% of the combined hazard cost, which comprises the central government expenditure plus the Insurance Council loss claims and the EQC loss claims. Now, if we look at risk reduction, the spend varies across the years. Some years are very large, some years are very small. These are the red bars you see here. It accounted for 25% of the central government's spending over the 10-year period, or 6% of that combined hazard cost. Now, just by way of comparison, most countries internationally spend an awful lot more on recovery than they do on reduction. And the Australian Productivity Commission in 2014, for example, estimated that that country, they spent 4% of their total cost on reduction. So at 6%, New Zealand doesn't seem to be too different with that, maybe a little bit higher, but there's a big caveat on all these percentages, because it all depends on how you measure the total over which you measure your percentage. And one of the other things we find in international literature is that although all countries seem to follow the same broad pattern or framework of how they put their costs together, virtually all of them have differences in the way they put their numbers together. Finally, at the bottom we have this sort of green bar down here, which is other civil defence. It doesn't change very much over time. It seems to be fairly stable. It accounts for 27% of central government spending. And again, it's about 6% of the combined hazard costs, obviously slightly large, a little bit larger than the spending on hazard reduction. Next slide, please. And if you look at how the spending sort of breaks down by hazard type, as far as we can tell, the earthquake obviously still dominates the total cost for central government spending compared to the other types of hazard, but it is actually spread over time a lot more evenly, if you like, compared to the loss figures we showed before. Now, that's partly because the Insurance Council decided to load virtually all of the costs attributed to the Canterbury earthquakes to 2011. Whereas the here what we see is there's a sort of hangover, if you like, the events or spending that will be made in the years after 2011, but related to the 2011 sequence of Canterbury earthquakes, that will still be covered in the year which it applies, rather than the year in which the source event has been identified. So again, it's another little quirk as to how the data doesn't necessarily sort of make for easy analysis. On the other side, we have the weather events dominating all the non-earthquake spending. I should point out that the scales on these two graphs are radically different. Magnitude 10 is different, basically. So the figures you see on the right-hand side are about the 10th, basically, of those on the left-hand side. What you also see is that the flood hazard there, or the flood spending, is quite active in 2009 to 2012, but it disappears after that. So clearly there have been floods since 2012. The Edgecombe flood in 2017, which was the largest flood over that period, $61 million of losses. It doesn't seem to make any difference at all to the government spending. So there is a question about the recording of information in the government records that we're looking at here, and it makes it more difficult to try and monitor the spending against different hazards. Finally, wildfires. All we see on this graph is basically in 2009, so the Port Hill fires and the Tasman fire, well, the Tasman fire is out of range anyway, but the Port Hill fire in 2016 doesn't show up here. But we do know that Fire and Emergency in New Zealand spent $8 million, and DOC spent another $4 million in suppressing that fire. Both of those were obviously spending out of their baselines, and so they don't actually necessarily show up in the information which OAG would have looked at. Next slide, please. Well, having seen the general pattern of past expenditure by the Crown, we've done a simple projection to show how a continuation of the past decade's rates of loss and central government spending might play out in future, given growth in population, economic activity, and asset values at risk. Basically, we used annual expected values for storms and floods, and we had a 1% average probability of large earthquake. That was different from what the average over the past 10 years would be, and that's because we assume that the Christchurch earthquake was exceptional and is unlikely, although not impossible, to get a similar scale event over the next 3 decades. But we've taken geophysical advice there and assumed a 1% average probability of a large damaging earthquake of a similar scale. Now, what this shows is that from other things held constant, in other words, no climate change, From 2020 to 2025, the government liability is, on an annual basis, is likely to rise from about $0.7 billion a year to $3.3 billion per year. Now that amounts to a compounding annual growth rate of 5.5% a year. And this can be compared to a projected 4.8% compounding average annual growth rate on Crown revenue and GDP. So in other words, the growth in population and the growth in asset values is basically sort of bumping up, if you like, the impact of events at the rate that they've been occurring over the last 10 years. Now, if we were to apply climate change to that, and we have done this using the Ministry of Environment's moderate representation concentration pathway of 4.5, the Crown liability rises slightly to about 5.6 to 5.7% per year. The variation being depending upon the assumptions that we make about the rate in which increased temperature translates to increased rainfall, and that translates to increased flood liability. Under a more extreme RCP of 8.5, then the compound annual growth rate rises up from 5.7% to 5.9% per year. As I say, these are all projections. They are not forecasts or detailed scenarios, and I'm sure that other work in that space is being done elsewhere, and that will become apparent over time with results. Excellent. So overall, what do we conclude? Well, natural hazards are obviously big, but perhaps not catastrophic. They're big in the sense that $48 billion combined spending by government and by the losses implied by the EQC and the insurance council claims. That's obviously an understatement because it doesn't account for all the uninsured losses. It doesn't account for all the indirect effects as well. So they're big, and they'll be dominated by seismic activity. But the GDP impact was actually quite muted and short term, mainly on Canterbury and on specific industries, particularly tourism and tertiary education. And I know that Treasury in its 2018 investment statement did a stress test of a hypothetically much larger Wellington earthquake, which would result in a 30% fall in GDP, but found that it did not push government debt levels above the Treasury's target of 20% of GDP as being the safe standard. Yeah. And that was even when it was combined with lingering GFC effects. So yes, these are big, they're painful to deal with, but they're not necessarily the largest things that could happen. And of course, we have the COVID-19 recovery facing us at the moment. A similar size set of earthquakes or hazards on top of COVID-19 recovery could be a very different story. Next slide, please. So why is this important? Well, obviously New Zealand is a risk-prone nation. Natural hazards present a major item of expenditure across government, both for its own assets, for example, keeping the road networks operating, but also to expedite recovery for regions suffering impacts beyond their ability to repair and recover. Now, as long as the regions are in a damaged state, they are not contributing to GDP, they're not contributing to government taxes. So there is a fiscal incentive as well as a general welfare incentive to try and get them back up and running in a reasonable time. And for that reason, there may be a case for thinking that the way that government can actually assist us accelerating that recovery where particular regions are badly hit. The other reason it's important is that government exposure to residual risk is unbudgeted. So the question is, can we actually invest now to lower that future exposure and the cost of liabilities that might be faced in the future? You need to take into account that insurance is becoming more costly in the face of natural hazards and exacerbation by climate change. So there might be more uninsured loss to accompany future losses in future. And also the decisions need to be made under considerable uncertainty. A lot of these hazards actually have a time frame which is difficult to predict. We don't know when they're going to happen, or even how big they are, or where they're going to fall. And because of that, it may be difficult to actually persuade communities to actually invest what they would be investing in order to protect themselves in a timely fashion. So ultimately, the question is, how can we use mitigation, if you like, to sort of help optimise the use of the resources that are available to New Zealand and to the Crown itself, in view of the priorities against economic and social objectives, in view of community acceptance, what people are prepared to pay, and also in view of what other funding partners may do to either exacerbate or alleviate the future risk. Next slide, please. But just to recall here the various ways of thinking about managing risk, and I'm sure this is very familiar to anybody who's been dealing with hazard management over the last few years. Basically, with the risk, you can either avoid it, you can try to control it, you can transfer it to other people via insurance, or you can accept it and try to deal with it the best you can. And of course, in civil defence in New Zealand for some years now, we've been thinking about the 4 R's. We can think about reduction or mitigation of risks ahead of them actually happening. We can think of being ready for things to happen at any moment. We can think of responding when things do actually happen. And we can think about the actual recovery process, being prepared to actually recover quickly and get things back running quickly. Next slide, please. So if you think about what are the mitigation options, mitigation is basically reducing hazard events' likelihood or their severity. Now, avoiding likelihood might include thinking of relocation away from high-risk zones, which is perhaps a role for greater use of land use planning, for example. Also, it could be about reducing severity, and that might mean lowering the vulnerability to hazards. So there's a role for building code, perhaps, and scientific standards to actually make buildings stronger against hazards. Now, some hazards, for example, drought, maybe reflect longer-term issues about how water is allocated and how limited it is that water transfer is going to occur between different farms. Now, that's something that could actually be partly addressed through the RMA reforms coming up in future. But there may also be things that to be done in a more short-term basis to try and facilitate the way that droughts get handled. Thirdly, we need to remember that scale effects tend to be inversely proportional to the frequency. Large earthquakes are big, but they actually tend to be quite infrequent. Storms and floods are more frequent, but much less severe in their impacts. Finally, we might think about, if you want to spending your mitigation money wisely, I mean, we need to exploit the scope for actually targeting mitigation on the areas where it's most likely to be of use. Now, these areas might include locations for floods, for example. We know where they land most of the time. It may be about wildfire. Not so much in a macro sense, but we know from international literature that encroachment of settlements into certain types of vegetation actually increases the risk. And that can be, again, another role perhaps for land use planning to try and actually sort of ensure that appropriate sort of separation of flammable material and urban areas is maintained. We would note that the 2016 Port Hill fire, for example, affected more buildings and caused more damage and cost more to suppress than the Pigeon Valley Tasman fire. But the Pigeon Valley fire was actually much larger in area. Next slide, please. So, when we think about how we target mitigation, value for money would probably come from a combination of finding effective targeting and finding measures which are both low cost, highly effective, and have no or low unintended effects. It might also be helpful in terms of getting community buy-in if you have investments that provide benefits regardless of whether an adverse event occurs. For example, with flood schemes, it's quite common to find that between banks and stock banks, you can have recreational spaces using the ground there. It doesn't matter too much if they get flooded every now and then. There's not so much value being lost there, but it is providing something for the community and something that they see which doesn't depend upon a flood actually happening. I mean, we don't know precisely when a flood is going to happen. There are some examples of this, which we've covered in our report, the Waimea River Flood Protection Scheme, for example. We've also found some examples of managed retreat and finding ways of encouraging landowners to actually accept managed retreat. Basically, what we've concluded in our report is that the highest potential for mitigation are really those ones where you can actually target effectively, which is areas subject to flooding, storm surge, or monitored landslides. And there are a few of those around the country which can be predicted to actually have damaging effects sometime in the near future. Conversely, the lowest potential are probably effects on high winds, drought, earthquakes, and wildfires. And the reason why they're the lowest potential is they can actually apply anywhere. So any mitigation applied widely would have to cover the whole country. And that obviously puts the cost up whereas the benefit may be a long time to see. Next, please. So in conclusion, the government liability, or so government faces significant unbudgeted exposure to liability for natural hazard impacts. And climate change is going to raise us in future, and insurance is only going to cover some of that risk and is becoming costly over time. We also note that local councils are financially constrained and may accentuate the liability for risk in some instances by the controls they have, or lack of control perhaps, over land use planning. Now, international evidence shows that mitigation can markedly reduce expected costs. There are international studies that show positive benefit cost ratios for measures aimed at more resilient housing against earthquakes, storms, flooding and fires, particularly in the US, where data allows tailoring of priorities for each region. Now in New Zealand, Brands has done some studies on resilience against floods and high winds, but the level of information is really relatively limited, and so there's only very few cases where we have information on that, and more can certainly be done. So in conclusion, really, if we can target the mitigation on known high hazard locations, areas prone to flood, storm surge and monitored landslides, if we can provide a mitigation with multi-purposes for which the public can see some benefit and be prepared to pay towards, even if hazard events don't occur for a long time, we probably need to think about adjusting the accounting systems to be more transparent in identifying hazard spending and monitoring its progress over time. And finally, thinking about how we can persuade other funding partners to create less liability, to actually bring all of the resources into hazard management that are available to the country. So that might mean national policy statements, customised financial assistance perhaps to help local government avoid some problematic hazard risks, or otherwise just keeping the message out there that hazards are going to happen sometime and we need to be prepared. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That's a real quick run through of what is a 70-page report. So for those of you not aware, that report is on the DIA website, and we've also recorded this, and I'm sure if you want to get a copy of those hard copy of those slides from Peter, that's fine too. And remember then also to any questions you have specifically on that direct presentation, to send those through to Paul and Prima. We're going to turn now to the panel. So we're going to get some comments and reflections from firstly from Graham. So for those of you that don't know Graham, Graham is a manager of flood protection at Wellington Regional Council, and has also been very involved with the Rivers Management Group, and with the, you work, Paul, Graham, on some of the MPS work around some standards on, also around flood protection.
Yes, done with a range of different work over the years.
So you've been right through all this, and you've also been involved in consulting in Asia and the Pacific, so you're seeing this in some international perspective as well. Yes. So what's your reaction to that?
Oh, I'm actually ecstatic with the report. It looks really good. I mean, you couldn't not be. It's focused and said that, you know, flooding is one of those hazards that you can put in place in mitigation, and I think we've been trying to say that for a long time. So really pleased to see that as an outcome, and understand there's going to be more work that needs to be done in it to fine-tune that, and keep plugging away at government to say, come on, it's time for government to come back to the table and put some investment into this flood mitigation. And this report's certainly shown that it's very good value for money. So really pleased to see it, and really keen to keep working with the whole team really about how we can keep working on it. It's only going to get worse, and we need to be fronting up to it. I think the cabinet paper that was put that possibly kicked this work off certainly had the right measures in there from our perspective, from a local government perspective. One in there I just noticed, that wouldn't just notice, but the beneficiaries pay, and I think that's a message that local government has always been pushing, that one of the beneficiaries, i.e. government, isn't at the table, and all of the costs are falling on local government and direct landowner beneficiaries, and we'd like to see an opportunity to say, well, those beneficiaries are spread more widely than just those communities sitting right on the edge of the river. And hopefully this report will give us some opportunities to push that story and get out there. Looking at it, I very much the mitigation is the way to go. The ways in which we mitigate it, I wonder whether there's some more work that could be done in terms of, I'll put it back to the ones that you've got there, the avoid, control, transfer and acceptance. And somehow when I was looking at the report again last night, how you would get the right balance, because that's what we're really keen on getting to. From our experience, 50s and 60s, government, great investment in building structures and putting in place a lot of mitigation that worked really well. Then suddenly they were gone, not at the table anymore, all fell back on the individual landowners, and that investment really dropped away and nothing much happened. So I'm seeing a move back. I'd hate to see us swing right back towards the other way. I don't think that would do us any good. So some ability to measure and work out what levers we can pull and what are the best levers to pull in that whole suite of mitigation. But certainly see that some of those structural mitigations are providing very good value for money, and that's certainly going to be one place. But the planning measures, where we keep on building in dumb places, I'll call it, digging the hole deeper, building higher structures, and then just continuing to develop behind, we've got to break that cycle somehow. And it's going to be a challenge because it's right down to, I'll say in the end, private property rights, I suppose you might call it, and that's why it's needing something beyond local government to help address that issue and put a proper mix of measures in place. So yeah, good work, really agree with it. I think you're on the right track. As I say, could not agree with it. We're ready to be part of it and help.
Well, thanks, Graham. Wendy Saunders, you're working as a senior natural hazards and climate change planner in a science organisation, so I guess you bring some of the planning and some of the science together. So interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah, kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for your presentation, providing an overview of the report, which was really interesting to read, and includes figures on the costs of events on our government and therefore really on all of us. We live in a geologically active country surrounded by water, so we need to be quite pragmatic about where we live, work and play, but with a view for a sustainable future where we don't have to keep moving away from harm. This report provides the evidence basis on needing to spend on risk reduction measures to ensure that we can prosper in the future, plan wisely now, and not have to burden our future generations with legacy planning issues. We cannot be complacent, and we need to spend now to save later. We have a great opportunity now to begin this spend to save philosophy, using all the opportunities we can to incorporate resilience into projects, both big and small. Through promoting investment in resilient planning, design, construction, and other risk reduction tools, we can achieve the sustainable management and development of our country. But we also need to look at how we can integrate resilience into investment analysis to understand how a small cost upfront can result in significant economic benefits in the longer term. The report provides the evidence basis for this. For example, a cost-benefit ratio of 12:1 for improving earthquake resilience for transport and utilities. Spending on risk reduction can be complex. Flooding, for example, requires investment in multiple aspects, such as structural engineering works, river monitoring, warning systems, flood modelling, land use planning policy, and catchment management. Each of these aspects needs to be adequately funded so that the residual risks are reduced, and insurance is there only for when these residual risks are realised. One cost that particularly caught my attention in the report is that of drought, which is kind of the silent and creeping hazard, which is costing over $1 billion a year. And droughts will become more frequent as the climate continues to change. So do we need to be investing in changing our land uses in drought-prone areas to reduce these risks? I think there's some difficult conversations ahead of us around that. The vision of our National Disaster Resilience Strategy is that New Zealand is a disaster resilient nation that acts proactively to manage risks and build resilience in a way that contributes to the well-being and prosperity of all New Zealanders. And from an insurance perspective, the EQC vision is that natural hazard resilience becomes embedded in all aspects of decision making for our homes, towns and cities. So this report provides the much needed benefit cost ratios to help decision makers in justifying a spend on reduction. Hopefully now, with the reviews underway of the Resource Management Act and other governance frameworks, this important benefit cost ratio can be used to justify spending now to save later across all aspects of development and risk management. Only then will we be on a pathway to becoming a truly resilient nation. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindy. Okay, and then finally we're going to turn to Ken Warren. Ken, the Treasury's got a deep and abiding interest in making good decisions, and just because there's some positive cost benefit on this isn't enough. We still have to make decisions, and we're in a constrained optimization environment. So as Chief Accounting Advisor and General Representative of the Treasury, Ken, what are your thoughts on this?
Sure, Tom, thank you, and tēnā koutou katoa, everybody. Yes, thanks very much to the DIA for sponsoring the research and for the NZIA's presentation, and for gathering a panel of diverse presenters. I'm coming at this from an accounting and a management angle, and rather than expressing Treasury views. So I want to make that reasonably clear up front. But I think, as an accountant, you do get some different perspectives, but first and foremost, good cost benefit analysis is crucial, and I'm a fundamental believer of it. Good. Next page. But there are challenges in cost benefit analysis, and I think this report has shown those out, both on the cost side, which a lot of the challenges are alluded to in the report. There are also, I think, challenges on the benefit side, what it is we value. But I think there are also some opportunities to be grabbed here. As a believer in cost benefit analysis, I think this is a very valuable piece of work in getting us closer to and pointing the way towards more informed decision making. And I applaud it for that reason. Not because I believe in the accuracy of the numbers. Quite frankly, I'm relatively suspicious of this. But I'm an accountant and I'm old. And so I remember back to the early mid-1980s, and I was reminded of that when I read this report. In those days, we had a thing called PSAC, Public Sector Accounting Concepts, and where departments were encouraged to produce financial statements and balance sheets. And that work was a precursor to and was fundamental to the Public Finance Act 1989 reform and the production of financial statements. Wouldn't have a lot of faith in the numbers that were produced by those departments back then, but it was absolutely fundamental to enabling those reforms to go ahead. And I see this as very much in the same way, a kind of precursor and a starting point, pointing the way, pointing towards things that need to be addressed. So let's look at the cost side of it. I think there's two things that have come out for me. One is the attribution of costs, and the second is the measurement of costs. The attribution is really important here because different players incur the cost of resilience investments and other people get the benefits. And if you imagine there's we might invest too much or too little, there's a point on return on investment that is maximised, so you get the sort of hill that's in the chart there. We know risks cascade past tipping points and societal impacts. So the best return on investment for an asset owner, even if it's a government, is likely to be the small hill, whereas the best point of resilience investment for the country as a whole would be more likely to be the larger point. So, and the report talks about a government having an undefined liability for reinstating infrastructure and making good. We'll make progress if we define that undefined liability. Cost attribution is an essential part of this analysis. And that leaves aside the whole issue of measuring expenses. The measurement base has been taken off appropriated costs. So the the costs for Christchurch that were met out of the National Disaster Fund, out of the EQC premiums, aren't really in this. But we don't actually have a National Disaster Fund anymore. So when the next big one hits, that's not going to be there. And when you look at overall at the costs, you get additional expenses for sure, but you also get losses in revenue, you get impairments of assets, and you get liabilities crystallising. We need to have that kind of full framework in there. And both Peter and Wendy referred to droughts, which I read with quite a bit of interest there. The report referring to the 12-13 drought costing 1.3 billion and GDP, and 2007-9 drought costing 2.8 billion. Well, tax takes about 28% of GDP. So roughly that puts the fiscal impact of those two droughts at over $1 billion. So you add that into the analysis, you might actually push the drought up to priority level. And that deal will be sealed if Auckland runs out of water this summer. So the analysis shows us the work we need to do on the cost measures and where we need to do more. So I applaud it for that reason, not because I'm actually a great believer in the numbers. But the second thing is the benefits and how we sort of put the benefits equation ahead. And what do we want from our investment in natural hazard mitigation? And what do we think is important? Do we want to prioritise response capacity or prioritise risk reduction? Do we want to survive or do we want to thrive? And I think NZIER's case has mainly been focusing on the benefits of cost pain reduction, so the bottom left-hand corner here. But and the case, I think, has been reasonably well made there. But the followers of Taleb's anti-fragile would suggest we should be aiming for the top right, where we make investments so that we can actually thrive through disasters. An improved system needs to be clear about what it is we want, so that investments can be made and progress measured accordingly. Some of you will want all four. You want to achieve all those four things, but there's a limited amount of resources to be allocated, and choices between those boxes are going to be made whether knowingly or unknowingly. And finally, I want to kind of sort of circle back to the attribution point and perhaps be a wee bit more upbeat. NZIER talked in their report about avoid, control, transfer, accept, where different risks sort of fall on different people. I think we can perhaps be a bit more nuanced to refine than that. Within central government and within local government too, much of our exposure for risks is at the sort of moderate consequences end and happens fairly frequently. And so they're not big issues for local government and central government as a whole, if you think of it as one entity, but individually they're quite important for each individual public sector agency or each individual local government agency. And so they're willing to transfer that risk to markets at a higher price than what makes overall sense. And NZIER have done some work on this, and they have, sorry, not NZIER, MB have done some analysis, and they've determined that on an average year, the government pays about 100 million more in insurance premiums than it receives in claims. And if we can establish a captive insurer, a mutual where you're sharing the risk, so rather than just going straight from avoid and control to transfer, but have this mutual sharing risk, which is kind of what EQC does, which makes house earthquake insurance affordable in New Zealand. If we can do that, we can free up some funds to invest in mitigation, leading to a virtuous circle. And I think that sounds like a management opportunity worth pursuing. So I apologize for the analysis for what I was seeking to do, but I think it needs to be expanded so we're clear about cost measurement, clear about cost attribution, and take all the impacts of risk events into account. We need to challenge ourselves over the benefits we want to achieve, and we should grasp opportunities that are around to enable us to fund high-value mitigation investments. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ken. So getting some of those fundamentals right around information is key to getting
Yeah.
the foundation.
Preaching to an accountant.
Well, and I like this idea of thriving through disaster. I feel a t-shirt. Before I talk about next steps and close, I'm going to ask DIA Director Paul Barker again to just kind of reflect on the reflections. Paul.
Thank you very much, Todd. And look, it's been a very worthwhile sort of exercise. I'd just like to sort of acknowledge we threw this work out with quite a sort of challenging commission, and it hasn't been that easy to sort of get it together. So we're really very thankful for the way you've approached the work and also sort of persevering, particularly as we work through some of the breaking work that OAG was doing. So we think it's been kind of really very valuable, not just the findings, but actually the sort of the conversations that we've been having. A big thank you to our three presenters. We've asked for a range of different perspectives, and I think it's always worth remembering that we've got a lot of different sort of stakeholders and decision makers, and really appreciate your perspectives on there. There's a lot of different sort of stakeholders in this area, and really appreciate sort of the kind of insights that you and also your support for the work, which has been great. And last but not least, thank you very much for our Zoom audience. I just reiterate my comments at the beginning. Very happy to take sort of questions and comments and get back to you. In terms of how we want to use the work, we see this, some of the evidence base that's been set out has been really helpful, particularly because it covers pretty much most of the gamut of natural hazards, and that breadth of perspective I think is really useful. We've literally just this morning with the program steering group had a discussion, and that's been really helpful. Just those sort of challenging issues. If we can show positive cost benefit returns, what's getting in the way of investment, and that sort of discussion we're wanting to sort of really take out and continue to sort of engage with a wider audience. And also sort of within the wider government machine, there's a lot of interest. We've presented this work also to some groups like the Hazard Risk Board. We see it sort of playing into areas like national security. So we're really wanting to make maximum kind of use of both the findings and also the discussion. So my final comment is I hope you found today's session useful, that you indeed find value out of the report's findings, and we look forward to ongoing discussion and collaboration. So thank you all.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So yeah, it feels like the beginning of a discussion, just the beginning, and look forward to participating in it with you. So thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. E timata te hui rongo te whakara kotahi, ka kapi rongo te whakara kotahi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you, everyone.